All right, this is the fourth passage. Let's read the blurb. This passage is adapted from Philip E. Tetlock and Dan Gardner, Super Forecasting, the Art and Science of Prediction, 2015, by those people. Human beings have coped with uncertainty for as long as we have been recognizably human, and for most of that time we didn't have access to statistical models of uncertainty because they did not exist. So those are the two main points. Number one, we've been dealing with uncertainty for a long time, and we didn't have access to statistical models of uncertainty. Moving on to the second paragraph, he's going to talk about what it was like to make predictions for most of human history. Before this publication of that book that talks about probability, what did most people do? He says, line 9, before that, people had no choice but to rely on the tip of your nose perspective. He's going to use this example of seeing a shadow in the grass, which could be a lion. When you're using tip of your nose perspective, there's really three outcomes. He says, on the one hand, you could say, yes, it is a lion. No, it's not a lion. And something in the middle, maybe it's a lion. And then the point he makes about this is he says, the tip of your nose perspective will not deliver, what it will not deliver is a judgment so fine-grained that it can distinguish between, say, 60% chance that it's a lion and an 80% chance. That makes sense because in our minds, it's really hard to conceptualize what is the difference between a 60% and an 80% chance that it's a lion. He does admit, though, that making distinctions between 60 and 80% is actually not even necessary a lot of times. In 24, he says it was rarely necessary to make such fine distinctions. It may not even have been desirable. And one of the reasons is that line 30, trying to distinguish between 60 versus 80 could actually slow you down. And in the meantime, you're going to get eaten by a lion. In the third paragraph, he's going to continue to take this idea of the tip of your nose perspective. And now he's actually going to say that this preference for 2 or 3 setting mental dials, meaning yes, no, maybe, makes a lot of sense. He gives this example of a decline from 5% to 0% as being more valuable than 10% to 5%, because obviously when you go from 5% to 0, it goes to exact certainty. But then he says, line 33, both 0 and 100% weigh far more heavily on our minds than the mathematical models of economists say that they should. So he's actually saying that 0 and 100 are actually more important to us than anything in the middle. And he goes back to the example of, a lion. So what's the reason for that? Let's go up. Practically, he says, line 44, our ancestors couldn't maintain a state of constant alert. So the state of constant alert is actually the maybe. Because think about it, if you know it's a lion, you're going to run. If you know it's not a lion, you're going to feel safe. If it's maybe, you kind of have to stay alert. And then he says there's a heavy cognitive cost to that. And so there needed to be worry-free zones. So what's the solution? He actually says, line 47, what ends up happening is ignore the small chances and use the 2-setting dial as much as possible. The 2-setting dial is basically yes versus no, or it's 100% versus 0%. Anywhere in between, he says we should only use that, or we only use that when we absolutely have to. So in the next paragraph, he's going to talk a little bit more about the psychology of this 100% versus 0%. He says in line 52, we want answers. A confident yes or no is satisfying in a way that maybe never is. And that explains why, he says, the media turn to these single-minded people, these hedgehogs, who are sure they know what is coming no matter how bad their forecasting may be. He does say that there is a relationship between confidence and accuracy. Notice he says, line 59, all else being equal, our answers to questions like, does France have more people than Italy? They are likelier to be right when we are confident they are right than when we are not. Now he's talking about confidence versus accuracy. He says in line 62, I think this is the main point, confidence and accuracy are positively correlated, meaning to say that when one goes up, the other should go up. But on the other hand, research shows that we exaggerate the size of that correlation. So in other words, in general, it is true that the more confident you are, the more accurate you might be. But we assume that they're more closely related than they actually are, to say it another way. And then he gives this example of financial advisors. So he says people trust more confident financial advisors over those who are less confident, even when their track records are identical. What's one of the reasons? Possibly because line 67, people equate confidence and competence, which makes the forecaster who says something that has a middling probability, that would be like the 50%, of happening less worthy of respect. And what's the reason for that? He gives this quote in line 70. As one study noted, people took such judgments as indications that the forecasters were either generally incompetent, ignorant of the facts in a given case, or lazy. So basically he's saying if you give something like a 50% answer, you're likely to be perceived as either incompetent or lazy because people assume that you can probably find out the answer or the information to make a more accurate guess. And we're not even going to look at this graph until one of the questions asks about it. So let's go back and annotate the passage real quickly. So the first paragraph we said is talking about the fact that we've always had to deal with uncertainty, and there were no models or no statistics in history. Second paragraph talks about what they call the tip of your nose perspective. And we said that basically means three things: yes, no, or maybe, versus, in this case, a more fine-tuned or fine-grained judgment. So I'll just write fine-grained over here. Third paragraph, he talks about what our preference is, and our preference is for a 2 or 3 mental dial. So I'll just say 2 or 3 setting dial. In the next part is what we really want: yes or no certainty, for good reasons. The last paragraph, he talks about the relationship between confidence and accuracy. He says that they're mostly correlated, but we tend to think they're more closely correlated than they actually are. And the chart we're going to look at later, so let's go to the questions. Question 32, the main purpose of the passage. So for questions like these, the annotations are really going to help. Keep in mind how we annotated it from before. We said that the first paragraph talked about uncertainty versus statistics. Then they talked about the preference for 2 or 3 choice dials. And ultimately, we prefer 2 choices, yes or no. And the last paragraph, they talked about how confidence relates to reliability. Choice A, criticize the unreasonable expectations held by many human beings. There's really no criticism at all in the passage. He's actually just trying to explain why a lot of things happen, why we prefer choosing one way or the other, and why we, credit people who make predictions with more confidence as being more accurate. Choice B, contrast the behaviors of ancient and modern societies. He talks about that only briefly when he says that in the past we settle for broad predictions, but today we have statistics. Again, not really the purpose of the passage, and he doesn't really do it all that much. Choice C, offer an alternative explanation for an uncommon phenomenon. I have no idea what the uncommon phenomenon would be or what the alternative explanation would be, so C is just going to be out. Choice D, place a human tendency within an evolutionary context. So yeah, this one does seem to be the closest one. The human tendency would be to revert to that dial that has 2 or 3 switches, yes, no, or maybe. And he does actually say that this is a result of evolution. If you want to see that, it's in line 40. So once he talks about our preference for seeing 0 or 100, he says, line 39, again, this is not surprising if you think about the world in which our brain evolved. And again, the whole discussion about a lion, that's obviously meant to harken back to a time where our brains were still evolving. So D is going to be the answer. Question 33, which choice best supports the idea that reassurance provided by binary options extends beyond matters of personal safety? What are the binary options? Binary means 2. He's obviously talking about the 100% versus the 0%, or we could just think of this as the yes versus no, as opposed to the middle ground, which could be maybe, or that 60 versus 80%. So we're going to be looking for evidence that assurance of the binary options goes beyond personal safe. Choice A, 22 says, of course, when you were dealing with the present existential problems of our ancestors faced, it was rarely necessary to make such fine distinctions. This is still talking about the situation of the lion, and he says it's an existential problem, so we're talking about survival. So choice A definitely does not work. So we're going to cross it out. Remember, we're looking for something that shows that the binary option helps us in matters other than personal safety. Choice B, 39 to 41. Again, this is not surprising if you think about the world in which our brain evolved. So the world in which our brain evolved was that world in which there were existential threats. But again, this sentence in itself doesn't say anything about how the binary choice applies to other situations. So we're going to cross out choice B. Choice C, 49 to 51. 49, it says, only when something undeniably falls between these two settings, only when we are compelled, do we turn the mental dial to maybe. This is making the point that if the choice is between 100% or 0%, we do go to the middle area, which is maybe, but only when something actually falls there. And does that show that the reassurance for binary options goes beyond matters of personal safety? No discussion about that. So line 52 to 57, let's read it. 52 says, a confident yes or no is satisfying in a way that maybe never is, a fact that helps explain why the media often turn to hedgehogs, single-minded people who are sure they know what's coming no matter how bad their forecasting records may be. In this case, yeah, we are talking about predictions made by the media, and obviously predictions made by the media are not solely confined to just questions about survival. They're probably talking about weather trends, political trends, trends in society. This sentence does actually show that there's reassurance in terms of a binary choice in matters that go beyond personal safety. So choice D is the answer, and we'll go with that one. Question 34. The passage implies that probabilistic thinking did not become useful until... So the first question is, what do they mean by probabilistic thinking? So let's go back to the passage and look at the first paragraph. Notice what they say in line 4. It was remarkably late in history, arguably as late as 1713, when that book or whatever was published, before the best minds started to think seriously about probability. So probabilistic thinking based on this is probably that more fine-tuned prediction. In other words, in paragraph 2, when they talk about a 60% chance that a lion is there versus an 80% chance, that's what they mean by probabilistic thinking, in contrast to this tip of your nose perspective. So the question is asking that type of thinking, the 60% versus 80%, when did that become useful? Definitely later in history, but let's see what the answer choices say. A, the problem of daily survival became a less pressing issue than it had been in the past. This actually makes sense because in the second paragraph, he does talk about how when there was issues of daily survival, you actually did not need the middle option. The first two, yes or no, were more useful. So let's look at that real quick. Line 23. When you were dealing with the pressing existential problems our ancestor faced, meaning survival, it was rarely necessary to make such fine distinctions. By fine distinctions, they mean 60 versus 80. So they mean the probabilistic thinking. It may not have even been desirable. Line 28, the ability to distinguish between a 60% probability and an 80% probability would add little. In fact, more fine-grained analysis could slow you down and get you killed. So A definitely makes sense that when daily survival was less of an issue, then this type of distinction could be more useful. Choice B, it didn't become useful until sophisticated technology was devised that was able to provide fine measurement distinction. So I think this is kind of getting the cause and effect kind of reversed. If you said B, it would say, you're basically saying that it became useful when this technology was developed, but most likely the usefulness of that type of thinking happened independent of when the technology was developed. You could conceive of a universe in which it was very useful to have 60 versus 80% predictions, but the technology was not yet developed. So B is not likely the answer. C, it didn't become useful until people realized it could be used to enhance common defensive maneuvers. Nothing in the passage that says that. Choice D, it didn't become useful until assessing the confidence levels of others became important to daily life. No mention in the passage about whether assessing the confidence levels of others is important to daily life, so we're going to cross out C and D. Remember on these questions, even if something's true, it's got to be clear enough that it was written in the passage for it to be a good answer on the SAT, and clearly we found that with choice A, but not with C and D. Question 35, as used in line 36 and 37, delivers most nearly means. So let's start in 34. Why is a decline from 5% to 0% so much more valuable than a decline from 10% to 5%? Because it delivers more than a 5% reduction in risk. It delivers certainty. So what is it? It is obviously the decline. And so what are they saying? That when you go from 10% to 5%, that's not much of a big deal because they're both relatively similar. But going from 5% to 0% gives certainty because 0% means something is definitely not going to happen. That decline gives more than just a 5% reduction in risk. It pretty much eliminates all the risk. And so a good word for deliver, in my opinion, would be give or offers, something like that. So choice A, surrender, it's a little bit off because you don't want to say the decline surrenders more than a 5% reduction in risk. Releases implies that it had been like captured before and then or somehow restricted from our viewing and then it got released. Transport has to do too much with like physical movement, like you transport objects or transport data. Choice D, provide, is probably the most general one because as we said, our offer was give or offer. The idea that a decline provides more than a 5% reduction it makes the most sense. 36, the phrases cognitive cost and worry-free zones help convey a sense of. So let's go back to the third paragraph and see what they're talking about. Let's start in line 37. The point that he's making in that paragraph is both the 0 and 100% weigh far more heavily on our minds than the mathematical models of economists say they should. What's his reason? He says, thinking about the world in which our brain evolved, there was always a tiny chance that a lion was lurking. But, line 44, our ancestors couldn't maintain a state of constant alert. The cognitive cost would have been too great. They needed worry-free zones. So what he's really saying is, as we said before, that we prefer the 0 versus 100 because anything in the middle incurs this cognitive cost. In other words, we're going to be put in a constant state of alert, and human beings just can't do that over the long run. That's why, line 47, the solution is to ignore small chances and use the 2-setting dial, that's 100 versus 0. Either it's a lion or either it isn't, and only if something undeniably falls in between do you actually use the setting that's maybe. So keeping that in mind, what's conveyed by this idea of cognitive cost and worry-free zones, really we're talking about how much alarm we have to be in. So we're looking for an answer like that. Choice A, mental toll of continued uneasiness. Yeah, so that definitely seems to work because they're talking about being in a state of alarm or being worried. So that's definitely mental toll of uneasiness. B, physical damage caused by ongoing attacks. We're not talking about getting attacked just yet. We're talking about worrying about the fact that there might be an attack if you're only like 50% sure that it's a lion. Choice C, intellectual challenge of solving difficult puzzles. Nothing to do with the passage. Choice D, grave consequences of sudden decisions. It's not yet at the point where we are making decisions, so D is going to be out and A is the best answer. Question 37, according to the passage, which choice best states the relationship between the confidence level of someone providing a judgment and the accuracy of the judgment? So remember, the relationship between confidence and accuracy is something we talked about in the last paragraph. Generally, they are correlated, and people often think that they're too closely correlated. Let's look at that real quick. Line 63, it says, confidence and accuracy are positively correlated. But research shows that we exaggerate the size of that correlation. In other words, we think that they're more closely related than they actually are. We're going to look for an answer that kind of says something like that. Choice A, the greater the confidence level of someone providing the judgment, the less accurate that judgment will prove to be in the end. If this said more, that would work, but less means that they are actually not correlated. So A is out. B, the greater the confidence level of someone providing the judgment, the more likely people are to scrutinize the accuracy of that judgment. This is also kind of saying the opposite. Scrutinize means to kind of examine very closely. The greater the confidence level someone providing the judgment, the more assurance that's going to give to people, and the less likely they'd probably be to scrutinize the accuracy because they're already assuming that the prediction is accurate. Choice C, the greater the confidence level of someone providing a judgment, the more accurate that judgment is likely to be up to a certain point. C does seem to say what the passage is saying. In general, they are correlated, so the greater the confidence level, the more accurate it's likely to be. And then when we read that people generally assume it's a higher correlation than it is, that's covered by what they say here, up to a certain point. Choice D, the greater the confidence level of someone providing the judgment, the more accurate that judgment will nearly always be. This would be okay, except for this last part to say that the more accurate that judgment will nearly always be. That's certainly not what the passage is saying, and that contrasts directly with choice C when it says up to a certain point. So choice D is out and C is the best answer. Question 38, the author's main purpose in citing the study in the last sentence of the passage is to. So why is he citing that study? Let's go back to the passage. So for this question, it pays to look back to maybe line 67. It says, people equate confidence and competence, which makes the forecaster who says something that has a middling probability, like 50%, of happening less worthy of respect. As one study noted, here's the study, people who took such judgments, the 50%, as indications the forecasters were either generally incompetent, ignorant of the facts in a given case, or lazy, unwilling to expend the effort required to gather information that would justify greater confidence. So what's the point of mentioning this quote and that study? Because he's really using it as evidence or proof that people equate confidence with competence. Because in the case where someone gives like a middle probability, 50%, which is less confident, people are likely to assume that they're incompetent, ignorant, or lazy. The purpose in citing that study is to offer quotations from subjects that appear to contradict some of the ideas. Not really, the quotation actually backs up the idea before and most of the ideas in the passage, so definitely not contradict. We'll cross off A. B, note several irrational conclusions subjects have reached that support claims made earlier in the passage. B could work, assuming that someone is lazy or incompetent with no evidence could be described as an irrational conclusion, and that does support the idea that people generally equate competence with confidence. Choice C, compare contemporary subjects with the ancient humans described in the passage. Not the reason for citing that particular study. The reason was basically to back up that earlier claim. D, suggest how economic forecasters can use information provided in the passage to improve their reputations. That quote itself does not offer a how, it's basically offering evidence, so D is out, and B is going to be our best choice. Question 39 says, according to the graph, so before I even read the question, I'm going to go back and look at the graph just to get a general sense of what's going on. So the title is Number of Forecasts of the Probability That a Stock Price Would Increase. And then we have the number of forecasts here, and then we have the probability that stock prices would increase, and we're comparing two people, forecaster P and forecaster Q. Forecaster P's predictions, most of them are in the mid-range. In other words, he's got a lot of predictions that are 50%, and everything else is kind of evenly distributed. Compare that to forecaster Q, who's got very few predictions in the 50% range. He's got a lot of predictions in the 0% probability and a lot of predictions in the 100% probability. So safe to say that forecaster Q is more confident in his predictions than forecaster P just by the numbers themselves. According to the graph, which choice represents the number of forecasts made by forecaster P that predicted a stock price had a 50% probability of increasing? So this is really just, read the bar graph. The number of forecasts by forecaster P in the light gray that had a 50% probability is right here, and the number is 10. So that's going to be the answer, and that's choice C. Question 40 and 41 should be done together, but we can probably get a good idea first. It says, based on the graph and the passage, people would be most likely to follow the advice of which forecaster? So let's look at the graph real quick again. Given that forecaster Q is clearly more confident, I'm going to go with that, because remember the point that was made in the passage is that people like confidence. They equate confidence with competence. So I'm going to cross out choices C and D because they have to do with forecaster P. Let's read A and B. Who would they go for? Forecaster Q, because his or her predictions proved to be more accurate than the predictions of forecaster P. So we don't actually know how accurate they were. That information is not given to us by the graph. So likely it's not going to be A. B, forecaster Q, because his or her predictions offered greater certainty than did the predictions of forecaster P. So that's the difference. The fact that forecaster Q had a higher number of predictions in both the 0% and the 100% than forecaster P shows that he was more sure of his predictions. so greater certainty. But however, we don't know how accurate either of them was or were. So most likely the answer is going to be B. Now let's look at 41, and we have to find the evidence. Which choice provides the best evidence for the answer to the previous question? Choice A, lines 18 to 21. What the tip of your nose perspective will not deliver is a judgment so fine-grained that it can distinguish between 60% chance that a lion is there and an 80% chance. This sentence has nothing really to do with, whether people are going to more go with forecaster P or Q. So A is not going to work. Choice B, 28 to 29. 28 says the ability to distinguish between a 60% probability and an 80% probability would add little. Nothing that helps us to determine which forecaster anyone would choose. Choice C, line 63 to 64. But research shows we exaggerate the size of that correlation. So this is basically saying that, yeah, confidence and accuracy are together, but people exaggerate the size. That could work as evidence because they're saying that since people exaggerate the size of the correlation, maybe they go with forecaster Q. We'll keep choice C for now, and then let's read lines 67 to 70. And people equate confidence and competence, which makes the forecaster who says something that has a middling probability of happening less worthy of respect. Compared to the previous sentence that we just read, this one is way better as evidence that people would likely follow forecaster Q because it's basically just more direct. They're saying that because they equate confidence and competence, the forecaster who says something with a middling probability, that would be forecaster P, is going to be less worthy of respect. Therefore, they're going to go with forecaster Q. So at the end of the day, choice D is much better than choice C, even though choice C kind of is going in the right direction. D is just more direct. Hey everyone, that was my walkthrough video for the October 2019 SAT. If you appreciate that, please hit like and subscribe below. More importantly, if you want to see me go through every single question on that exam, then please click below for my Udemy course. I believe in high quality and affordable education for everyone. So hope you guys enjoy.